Welcome to the American Addiction Recovery Association. I'm Jeff Breedlove in conversation with Representative Tran, a representative from the great state of Georgia. Representative Tran, thank you for joining us today in conversation.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to always be on with you.
Well, thanks. This podcast from AARA, we are talking to stakeholder leaders across America about the addiction epidemic and how we need a diverse community of leaders to come together to address the epidemic. And we are blessed, me and my brothers and sisters and families who have been impacted by this disease. Anytime an elected official will spend time from a policy perspective on this issue, because it is something that is dealt with in legislative bodies. It frankly deals with people's civil liberties. It deals with where taxpayer dollars go and don't go for programs. So I want to dive right in. You serve in the Georgia General Assembly in the State House of Representatives. What led you when your colleagues and people like me, advocates, came to you and said, would you sort of get involved and start going to meetings and start talking about ways that the General Assembly in Georgia could be supportive of families impacted by the disease? What drew you to that in the very first place?
So I grew up in the 80s in the Just Say No era. So drug addiction and access to drugs has always been a part of every community that I've lived in every stage of my life, from teenager to the college years to 20s and 30s, to now. We're seeing kids who struggled with COVID turn to vaping, and vaping leads them to drugs, and that gets them addicted. And for not just our community at the local level, but for our state and country, we have a labor shortage. And if we don't take care of our people so that they're in a healthy place to contribute to society, we're going to be very challenged as a nation to continue to prosper economically.
Tell us a little bit about you, your district, so that folks around Georgia and the nation can know a little bit about who we're talking to. So tell us a little bit about your background and a little bit about your district.
Yeah. So my name's Tran, and I represent House District 80, which is the northern arch of Atlanta, covering the cities of Dunwoody, Doraville, and Chamblee. A very diverse district, not just in ethnicity and race, but in economic profile as well. And so we can see the more lower income families have addiction issues and how they struggle with it, especially families that are like single parent households. And then we also see it in the wealthy areas like Dunwoody, where addiction doesn't necessarily start with illegal substances. It starts with painkillers and opioids from the hospitals. And they both lead to the same sad, depressing result. It derails families, it derails people economically. And so my background isn't actually in um, in this area. I worked in IT cybersecurity for a long time, and I opened up a coffee shop right before the pandemic hit. So I'm a small business owner. Um, but through those, I've seen just a wide variety of how people become addicted, become an alcoholic, and it just a shame to see a very prosperous life turn to homelessness for some folks.
Now, so there you are. Now, is the coffee shop still open?
The coffee shop is still open.
Give it a plug. Tell us the name of it.
It's called Peachy Corners Cafe, and I actually sold it about almost 2 months ago now.
Okay, so you sold it.
Yeah, which is a very good, fantastic thing. I'm very glad that the new buyers want to continue what we started, and it's a load off of my shoulders, because we've got a lot of stuff to deal with, and so I can focus a bit more on being a state rep with that off my shoulders.
But let me ask you this. So there you are, IT world, small business owner. I love a good cup of hot tea. Everybody knows that. Uh, what let's not about addiction, but just what led you to want to enter public service in the very first place? Why did you decide to run for office as a small business owner, IT kind of guy?
It's actually because of COVID and having my small business. So we opened up literally just a few weeks before COVID hit. In fact, I think we were the first business to close our doors before the governor announced that the state was closed. And we made this decision when we heard of the first case of a student having COVID. My wife and I, we have friends in Hong Kong and Italy, all over the world. And so we knew the pattern of once a couple of students gets it, it's like a snowball effect. And so we went ahead and closed so that our employees can get on, on unemployment, and we can go get the resources we needed to make sure that we can reopen safely. And I think because of that, my customers and my neighbors felt that they needed to see someone like me in the State House. And all of that troubleshooting I was doing through COVID, I was like, maybe there's something to it. So when my predecessor decided not to run for re-election, I was approached and I said, okay, let's give this a shot and see how it goes. And yeah, it's been, like they say, drinking from a fire hydrant. There's lots of problems to fix out there. And I think addiction is absolutely one of the most important ones.
No, absolutely. I make the case that there's no more important domestic policy issue than the addiction epidemic, and I make that case because as long as the number one cause of death in the United States for people 18 to 45 is a combination of overdose and fentanyl poisoning, I argue that if you are going to trust the science and you're going to trust the government, then we have to look at the government reports at the federal and state level that come out that show the math numbers of people impacted. And if your funding isn't congruent with that, you're going to have more funerals than you have recovery. And look, that's a great segue into, for our listeners outside of Georgia, in Georgia, you are part of something that is not in every state. It is in about, to our knowledge, maybe 5 or 6 other states. But the Georgia General Assembly has, in essence, a caucus. It's called it's got a long name. It's called the Georgia General Assembly Working Group on Addiction and Recovery, which is a long name, but it is bipartisan. It is members only. You have to be in the House or the Senate. And there's 230 something members in Georgia, 56 in the Senate, 180 in the House. But you guys and gals, ladies and gentlemen, come together, and it's one of the few areas in that building where the red team and the blue team work together. And it's strictly voluntary. What drew you to wanting to work with your colleagues at that level of leadership? And then I'll ask you a follow-up.
I definitely wanted to see, not just from my colleagues across the aisle, but from my colleagues that are on the same party as me, but from different parts of the state, how addiction impacted their life. And I don't think there's a single member in the State House who hasn't had a friend or a family member or a church member, someone in their community that they know that they've watched get impacted by addiction. And so to be able to talk about our different stories and find that common ground and all come into agreement that we need to address this, I think it's a rare thing in politics these days, but so incredibly important.
Oh, absolutely. And the work that the working group does should be emulated in all 50 states.
Absolutely.
The case can be made that Georgia has passed more legislation dealing with everything from treatment to prevention to harm reduction to clinical and peer-led recovery over the past 6 years or so than any other state in the United States. And most of those votes, most of the votes, and in fact, I think all the votes have been overwhelmingly bipartisan.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's special that y'all have built that. What would you say to a legislator that might, or a staff member of a legislator that might be watching this and listening to this in another state, as to why they should go to their speaker or lieutenant governor and say, let's do basically a caucus in our General Assembly? What's been the actual success that you would pitch to leadership in another state?
It's understanding the needs of not just within your community that you represent, but the other communities outside. And so I think as a working group, we're a great model for other states to understand that, say, if you're in Boise, Idaho, you represent that, but then you represent farmers in a much more rural area. You're going to have a better understanding of how to tackle this issue better than looking at the results of what Georgia is doing. There may be similarities, but there's nothing like knowing the data for your specific communities within your state. And that's the only way you're going to deal with this issue of addiction, because what leads people to addiction is different, not just from rural to urban, but like in my district, we have an old blue collar working class where a GM factory was the big employer, and then you had all the executives, doctors, lawyers, and Dunwoody. And as I said, the more blue collar families that's been there for generations, they're lower income. They were looking for escapes, whether it's through alcohol or illicit drugs, to kind of get through the day of just struggling to survive. While my folks in Dunwoody, they start off with painkillers and get addicted to that. Understanding that allows you to create programs that can address each versus trying to make a one size fit all program. And so every state needs a working group so that they understand the needs within their state specifically.
No, that's a great point. And you guys and the leaders of this that come together, it's not just legislation; it's funding too.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, also the case can be made that, and it's been bipartisan. It's been a Republican governor, and I know the majority party in Georgia is Republican, but they've been supported bipartisanly by the Democratic Party throughout these programs, and you've secured funding, historic levels of funding, that have gone directly into communities from Metro Atlanta to the most rural communities in Georgia. Why is it important that there be bipartisan support, not just for legislation, but for funding in the appropriations process?
Because the first line of defense with addiction starts within your community. And so we can fund our local communities, whether it's in rural areas or suburban areas, really well. That's the first line of defense. But then the second and third line of defense comes to the big urban areas like Atlanta, DeKalb County, Fulton County, where many people, they can't find the services or help that they need in their local community. They're going to end up in Atlanta. And so we got to make sure our urban areas are ready to treat those people when the first line of defense fails.
I want to ask you this question. It's sort of a more hardball question a little bit.
Yeah.
But people come to the Capitol, or they come to town hall meetings or city council meetings, just meetings in their community. And I think from a 50,000 foot level, there's basically three types of those people. There's people on the far right who are great Americans, who think the answer is to lock everybody up, whoever encounters drugs, throw away the key, and if you get somebody off the street, you've arrested a drug dealer. Then there's people on the far left, they're also great Americans, and they think there should never, ever, for any reason, be any legal consequence for anybody, anywhere in the pipeline at all. And then the third group is like the 80% in the middle who go, I don't know that either one of those extreme positions is really practical or workable. We just want real solutions because we want people that need medical help to get it, but we want people who are killing folks to maybe not do that. So, how do you navigate the extremes on either side to try to get to that strong bipartisan support where, frankly, a conservative Republican and a progressive Democrat can vote on a bill that 80% support, even if you can't make the far extremes happy? How do you work through that as an elected official?
So when I talk to folks on the far right, I often talk about recidivism and how expensive that is for our state that folks go through recidivism. Um, for the folks on the far left, I talk about how if we don't get them the treatment and if we aren't tough love with our treatment, so to speak, um, it's just going to lead to more problems. And more problems means less resources. And it just starts to kind of barrel out of control. If I can expand on this for a little bit, I've been fortunate to visit different countries over the past year, and I talk about addiction um, in these countries, especially when it comes to opioid and fentanyl, and in Sweden and here in Korea. I just had this conversation today, and Korea during COVID, they saw a big increase in drug use, and they realized incarceration was not working. The recidivism rate was just too high for them. And so what they're trying out is to, instead of sentencing someone to prison, you're sentencing someone to a rehab facility that the government has already set up, the government funds. And they're realizing that's far cheaper than what they spend to house a prisoner. And they're seeing a lower recidivism rate. Um, and so, the verdict's still out, but I see a lot of promising aspects to that because someone's using drugs, whether it's because their life is just miserable and they're looking for an escape, or they became addicted through painkillers. They're not hardened criminals. And now you're going to throw them in prison with hardened criminals who have unfettered access to connections outside of jail with drugs. And you're just putting these people on a bad road to fail and just come back in and get out, do drugs again. And so, talking to some of the electeds and doctors in these countries are like, yeah, if we catch them early, we get them into a rehab center instead of prison, get them. And what I like the most when talking to these folks is these rehab centers allows family and friends to visit, and that provides the support. When you're in prison, your visitation hours are very strict, and so you might not get the support from friends and family like you would at a medical rehab type of facility. And so I think there's a lot of economic arguments to be made to changing our approach and breaking the cycle.
No, I think that's a great point. And this episode, one of our very first ones of this series. We thank you for joining us from Korea. It's evening there when we're taping, and it's still morning here where I am. But let's go down that path. See, I also want to get your thoughts on, when we rethink in the United States, in every state, and no state better than Georgia, of course. Reimagine how we get serious about treating people who clearly only have, let's say for this scenario, they encounter law enforcement. And clearly they only have personal consumption amount of product on them, and they're not trafficking drugs.
Yeah.
To your point, if we take those people and put them in the criminal justice system and eventually they wind up in prison, it's just
surrounded
going to
by the
spiral out of
traffickers.
control. But if we
Yeah.
get them, some people say, well, just don't do anything with them. Let them go. Just let them go. And some people say, no, something like a drug court program, some type of incentivizing. That is so important because in the age of fentanyl, the age of experimentation is over. And sometimes there's not a second chance. And so what would you say to a constituent of yours who would be like, don't do anything to the person, just if they encounter law enforcement and they're just like using for personal consumption, that should strictly be medical and there should be no government involvement at all, other than to get them help, but not law enforcement.
Yeah. I think the tough love aspect is what I'm calling it. Tough love has to come into play. If an officer stops them, one, if they're intoxicated, if they're high, they need to be off the street for their own safety and the safety of the public. That's without question. What I don't want to see is that by removing them off the street, you're placing them literally next to a dozen drug dealers, right? That's not going to help them at all. And so we have to provide that safe space and hold them accountable. This is where the tough love is. Now, I'm not saying we cane them in a spot, but there has to be consequences for your actions. And so we find what that accountability is. Here in Korea, the rehab center is kind of like a prison. You don't get to just leave, but it's not prison conditions.
Right.
Now,
by the same token, what would you say to an OG law enforcement person who was brought up and trained? You roll up on the scene, you just arrest them. You don't, we have CIT officers now in Georgia. Officers do know they have discretion. We have the don't run, call 911 law. There are cases where, law enforcement might have to reimagine, and judges and the DAs and the sheriffs and the chiefs. To your point, we might temporarily bring somebody into custody, but they don't have to be charged with certain things. They don't have to have their records blemished for life. So how do we get to the point where we get laws in the books that give legal protection and authority to frontline officers, that they could take a path in between just letting them go and actually arresting them and charging them with, certain offenses? Do we need to explore a third path in the legislative process of how we address somebody who might have encountered law enforcement, but is clearly not trafficking drugs?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you, with some of your work, is doing exactly what we need for that third path. And that is breaking the stereotype of what a drug addict is. And when you ask people what a drug addict is, they think it's someone who's just mentally crazy or someone who's really violent, homeless. And it paints this image where the first thought is to just lock them away where we don't see them and we can forget about them. We have to humanize. I think for too long on this war on drug, we've dehumanized what an addict looks like so that it makes it easy to just lock them up. And so, how we create a path through humanizing drug addicts so that people understand just what they need and that they can successfully become contributing members of society. That's important. And how we make that third path viable, still working on it.
No, we have to work on it because it's also an economic development issue for cities and counties and businesses. The number one cost to a business leader, as you well know, is hiring the person and then retaining them and repeating the process. Yep. And so if we start to look at it also from the public sector taxpayer dollars and private sector industry, we quickly realized that if we find a different solution, we have a stronger workforce and we're not spending as many taxpayer dollars over and over and over again on the same person in the same scenario. What are your thoughts? What would you say to a business leader as to why a business should embrace uh, solutions for their employees that encounter addiction as opposed to just firing them?
If you just fire them, that's going to be, unfortunately, a cycle um, for a business leader because you're just, it makes you numb. So any employee that comes in that even starts to look like that, you're just going to fire them on the spot. I see it all the time, especially in the restaurant industry. People get tired of dealing with addicts. And so even someone who's not an addict, you just assume and you're firing, and that turnover rate is just crushing for a small business. Um, Someone who is can work with you to get through an addiction, I guarantee you that person's going to eventually become an excellent employee because, as they say, before you can love other people, you have to love yourself. And those who are willing to fight the addiction and improve themselves and get past it, they're going to they're going to be loyal to you as a business owner, and they're going to want you as a business owner to succeed as much as they themselves want to succeed because they don't want to fall back into that cycle. I've um, talked to employees of other businesses who love the business they work for, and they don't want to see that business close, and so they fight for that business. And I believe someone who, for whatever reason, they end up as an addict, they genuinely want to get better. They're going to be a great loyal employee when they reach that point.
Yeah, I got one more question. We have about 2.5 minutes, and at the end, I want you to tell folks how to find you on social media,
Sure.
so that folks listening to this from around Georgia and the nation can get to know you better on social media. But let me ask you another hard and direct question. You know, stigma. It's a fact that stigma is real. Stigma is a polite word for fear, hate, discrimination. But it's also true that recovery is real. But you know, in our, my son is from China. We adopted Jack from China. We're very active in the Atlanta Chinese community. You know,
Right.
in a lot of our international communities, our immigrant communities, there's there's a stigma still among elders in particular that we just don't have that here. And what would you say to leaders of the international community in a city like Atlanta, other big cities, and frankly other smaller cities like a Savannah, Georgia, where there's Jacksonville, Florida, where there's large international populations, immigrant populations, that it's okay to turn into this and acknowledge it is real in every community and help people in in what is in essence a minority community, but that you're not going to be run out of town if you confront this reality. What do you say to leaders of international communities?
That historically being in denial of the addictions in our communities has never turned out well. China has gone through many periods of opium abuses during their opium trades, and just being in denial that this is out there, that this is a problem, is, I think, with how dangerous fentanyl is. Um, if you don't recognize that this is a problem within your own community, one of your family members may end up waking up dead one day because you didn't see the warning signs because you didn't want to accept that this is a problem in our communities. And this is a problem that has been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years, um, across the board, not just Chinese, but Vietnamese, Korean, Filipino. Every community I've talked to, they at some point back in their homeland have gone through issues with drugs, and we're not immune to it here in America either.
Well, thank you. Thank you for talking a little bit of policy with us. Tell folks where they can find you on social media.
So you can find me on Instagram at long, Long, and then the letter X, and then Tran, Tran. You can also find me there on Facebook. I'm not really on Twitter, and I'm not really on TikTok. So those are the two best places. And then if you have any questions, if you're an elected official and you want to talk more about a working group, please feel free to email me at long, at longtran, LONGTRAN.com, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Look, Representative Longtran, thank you for your leadership for families impacted by addiction. This is Jeff Breedlove with the American Addiction Recovery Association in conversation with Longtran. Recovery is real.
Recovery is real.